The country of the Gadarenes. James VI died in March 1625. His sad and sordid life had done much damage to the church, but it was over at last. Well, his life was over, but was the damage? And what would his son do? When Charles I came to the throne, being a serious-minded man, chaste and religious, it looked as though he had every prospect of a successful reign in front of him. The threat of a Spanish marriage, with all the consequent advancement of Popery, which that would have entailed, had seemingly vanished with his marriage to Henrietta Maria of France. All the same, the Queen was a pronounced Romanist, who brought with her some Romish priests. What is more, by her marriage to Charles, Henrietta was in a position to ensure that popish influence was strengthened at court. Nor did she miss her opportunity. She was a zealous builder on the foundation her late father-in-law James had laid. She was headstrong, not least in her eagerness to gain many concessions for the Catholic religion. Throughout her reign, she was the undoubted mistress at Whitehall, and papal agents were openly cultivated in high places. Jesuits were encouraged to do their nefarious work. Daily masses were notorious. Charles could only weakly reprimand his wife, but she carried on in her high-handed way regardless. She was far too strong for him. All this meant that the royal marriage was a source of contention between the king and Parliament, seeing the latter became increasingly Puritan in outlook during the early years of the reign. Furthermore, the Puritans were offended right at the start by the ostentatious ritual and ceremony of the coronation on the 2nd of February, 1626. At the obnoxious performance, Charles was attended by 5 bishops in golden copes, the entire pageant being shown off against a tapestry backdrop decorated with a curiously wrought crucifix. It all smacked too much of Romanism for Puritan tastes. Even so, it was far too Protestant for Henrietta to stomach, and she simply refused to attend. The man responsible for the popish display was the up-and-coming cleric by the name of William Laud, he whom I mentioned earlier. Of this William Laud, the world was destined to hear a great deal more. James was dead, but his legacy was to prove disastrous for his heir. Nor would it be very pleasant for the men and women in the realm who loved scriptural religion. They were in for a very harsh experience. The Duke of Buckingham, that notorious two-faced manipulator, was still a force to be reckoned with, while Laud cast his long and sinister shadow over the coming years. Again, it must be remembered that under James, Arminianism had replaced Calvinism in the upper reaches of the Church of England. What is more, the new king's political inheritance was complicated by foolish foreign treaties his father had concluded. These were serious handicaps right from the start, fatal handicaps as it turned out. Yet it need not have been so. If Charles had only taken sensible advice, pursued a sane and straightforward policy, all could have gone relatively well. But Charles was very badly advised right from the beginning, especially by the wretched Duke of Buckingham. That clever man, having observed the discord between Charles and his queen, milked it for all it was worth. Using much subtlety, he made artful suggestions to Charles, touching him at his weak spot, thus gaining a growing influence over the young king. This influence showed itself when Charles asked for a massive sum of money from Parliament, but declined to say why he wanted it. What would he do with the money? He would not say. Parliament resisted the king's two-faced demands. They knew the money would be spent in support of papist efforts in France to crush the Huguenots, even though Charles protested most solemnly he would not do anything to advance Popery. In other words, the king committed himself to 2 policies which contradicted each other. Parliament was alert enough not to let itself be duped, and it firmly refused his requests, which meant that for 5 years, 1625 to 1629, the king and Parliament were embroiled in a running verbal battle. They were forever quarrelling, nearly always over money. In betrayal of his word, Charles did take steps to encourage Romanism, both at home and in France, including the release of papist priests from English prisons. One MP complained of the king's duplicity, saying in a debate, "I cannot believe he gave his pardon to a Jesuit, and that so soon upon his promise unto us." It was growing increasingly obvious that Charles was prepared to treat Parliament with contempt, and to fob off his critics with lies. He went further when he appointed an Arminian come semi-papist as royal chaplain, thereby challenging Parliament over the government and discipline of the Church of England. This led to yet another clash, since Parliament was in process of tinkering with its Constantine position on the relationship between state and church. It now wanted the state to support the church, but leave it more in control of its own affairs. In contrast, the king was going the other way. He hankered after a tighter grip on the reins of both state and church. To forge them into one and dominate both was his dream. He needed an able man to help him. Enter William Laud. William Laud, the rising star of the Church of England, was soon appointed the king's spiritual adviser. Laud, born in 1573, was educated at Oxford, and while there developed a lifelong love of Arminianism, with, obviously, a corresponding intense hatred of Calvinism. He earnestly desired to take the Church of England back to pre-Reformation practices, did all he could to encourage such a move, and virtually founded the Anglo-Catholic or High Church party. From the beginning to the end of his career, Laud never wavered. He gave voice to his popish tendencies when he alleged the necessity of baptism as the vehicle of regeneration, and the necessity of the episcopate to the existence of the true church. Bancroft, spoken of earlier, had done his work well. Various promotions came Laud's way under King James, until he was appointed Bishop of St. David's in 1621, in which capacity, in debate with a Jesuit, he openly stated that the Church of Rome was a true church. Charles took note and approved of this notion. As soon as he had the chance, he rapidly promoted Laud to Bishop of Bath and Wells in 1626, then Bishop of London in 1628, and finally Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. It was not only Charles, however, who approved of his protege's Romanizing, and could dangle tempting promotions in front of him. Laud, even when he was Archbishop of the Church of England, was to receive more than one offer from the Pope to become a cardinal, as he himself recorded in his personal diary. In all fairness, it has to be said that Laud was a very different man to the slippery Buckingham. At least he was honest and consistent in his principles. But those principles were staunchly Arminian, uncompromisingly so, thorough being his watchword. In reality, Laud was a virtual papist. He was even nicknamed a priest of Baal. He loved the trappings of Popery, and brought them back into the Church of England with a vengeance. Roman varnish, as John Owen would later call them, paintings, crossings, crucifixes, bowings, cringings, altars, tapers, wafers, organs, anthems, litany rails, images, copes, vestments, were the stuff of which Laud's religion was made. He forbade the clergy under his charge to preach on the doctrines of predestination and election. Nevertheless, Parliament resisted this growing tendency to Arminianism, and in the debate in 1629 already mentioned, one MP called it a Trojan horse for the advancement of Popery. The truth of this accusation was later borne out by a document found among Laud's papers, annotated in the prelate's own hand, authenticating it as a letter from a Jesuit to his superior in Brussels, dated March 1628. The Jesuit reassured the superior that things were going their way in England. "We have planted that sovereign drug, Arminianism, It flourishes and bears fruit in due season. For the better prevention of the Puritans, the Arminians have already locked up the Duke's, that is, Buckingham's, ears. Our foundation is Arminianism. This secret activity by Papists and Arminians admirably suited the purposes of Charles and Laud. But it was not all done in secret. Overall, the man who had advanced Arminianism in the early years of the reign of James had meanwhile gone on to propose that private confession should precede the Lord's Supper. Then, in 1617, Richard Neile at Durham started talking about an altar, and moving the noxious article to the east end of the church. Laud would certainly build on these suggestions. Indeed, he had been supported by Neile when he himself made the same changes at Gloucester, the very place where Hooper had laboured some 60 years before. It will be recalled that under James, Bancroft had been held in check on the introduction of these sinister developments. But times were very different now. King Charles, right from the start, made his father's slide into Arminianism seem like a genteel drift. Now it was to be the Gadarene rush to the precipice. The Arminians, Neile and Laud, along with Mr. Facing always, Buckingham, beavered away, demolishing Calvinism in the State Church on every hand. But Charles led from the front. He was the architect of the revolution, and as I explained earlier, a revolution it was. In 1626, Charles, through Buckingham, foisted an Arminian chancellor on Oxford University, making it an anathema to support the findings of Dort within the university. The House of Commons might complain about such goings-on, as it did in 1629, but Charles simply ignored all protest. The teaching of the canons of Dort was stopped on the grounds that the doctrine of predestination destroyed sacramental teaching and practice. Just so. Whereas the Bible teaches that God accomplishes his decrees of saving grace through the means of preaching, the Arminians cum Papists replaced preaching with the so-called sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. According to this, instead of sinners being called to salvation through the preaching of the gospel, baptized infants were started on the process of salvation by their baptism, after which a lifetime of regular attendance at confession and communion maintained it. This was, as ever, the high road to popish priestcraft. A liberal in theology, Laud was anything but liberal in his attitude towards those who disagreed with him. Puritan, separatist, independents, or Anabaptists, he was thorough, cruel and bitter in persecution, a sadist, a firm believer in torture for heretics. This was the kind of talk which appealed to Charles. As early as 1626, the king promised his man the See of Canterbury, since Laud was the most suitable incumbent in the eyes of Charles. After all, Laud proved his worth when he preached at the opening of Parliament that same year, declaring that Presbyterianism would mean the overthrow of both church and state. In other words, Presbyterianism or Calvinism in any shape or form was to be accounted treason under the new regime. Parliament replied that the opposite was the truth. It was the Arminians who, by bringing in Popery, were the real revolutionaries. Nevertheless, Laud and the king rode roughshod over all opponents, and they triumphed. The upshot of all this foment was that Calvinism languished sorely. The Presbyterians were reduced to a mere handful, and the Calvinistic Anglicans completely failed to withstand the onslaught. The Church of England simply became Arminian and popish. Laud supplied the king with a list of ministers, marked O and P. The Orthodox, in Laud's eyes, were to be elevated. The Puritans were to be despised and humiliated. But all this constituted far more than an attack upon Puritanism. As the years passed, Arminianism and absolutism would become one and the same in the public eye. The king had broken with the Calvinistic past, and he increasingly presented himself as an absolute monarch. No one would be allowed to question his actions. he became a tyrant. Undoubtedly, the notes of the Geneva Bible, which still held on to its popularity among the Calvinists, despite all attempts to impose the authorized version on them, encouraged some Puritans to preach openly of the rightness of resistance to the king under such circumstances as were beginning to prevail. One Nathaniel Barnard did so as early as 1632, foreshadowing the preachings of Stephen Marshall and many others during the actual civil wars a decade later. The early warning signs were there if only the king had a mind to read them. The reason is, the Geneva Notes, greatly valued by countless avid readers for their theological stance, included what were seen to be various political and seditious comments, though these formed only a small part of the whole. Nevertheless, these particular glosses were seized on by the growing number during the 30s and 40s, who were looking for justification of resistance to a tyrannical king. After all, the comments carried enormous weight, being printed alongside the scriptures themselves, and backed by the authority of Geneva. The authorized version had represented a political attempt to put a stop to any thought of resistance to the monarch, but this it signally failed to do when it mattered most to the king, the last copy of the Geneva Bible coming off the press in 1644. Even as late as 1715, the Geneva Notes were still being printed with the AV text. To give but a single example of the point I am making, Psalm 110 verse 3 in the Genevan version reads, "Thy people shall come willingly at the time of assembling thine army." It does not take much imagination to see what telling use that could be put to in the turbulent decades of the 17th century, and how in certain quarters it might be preferred to the new version of King James. Following one of the wrangles between Parliament and the king over money, Charles suspended Parliament for several months, and governed, or tried to, on his own. But eventually, out of sheer necessity, the need to raise ready cash, he was forced to summons another sitting. He used a trick to get round his opponents, promoting some of them to an office which debarred them from actually taking their place as MPs and voting against him. For all that, even now he could not get his way, whereupon he dissolved Parliament again. As the months passed, relations went from bad to worse. The king tried to raise a so-called loan. He wanted to debase the coinage. He sent the eager Buckingham on mad ventures against the Huguenots, rash schemes which wasted a fortune. Charles, who believed in the divine right of kings, received much-needed support and encouragement when some Anglicans argued that the king had the power to make laws which his subjects were bound to obey, that his legislative power was unbounded, that he could raise taxes without consent of Parliament. One Church of England minister preached the duty of passive obedience to the king, even when his commands were opposed to Scripture. Another went as far as to state that disobedience to the king would lead to eternal damnation. In 1628, Buckingham was assassinated, which meant that the king, having lost his public shield, was now exposed to the full fury of political criticism. If Buckingham could ever be truly called a friend, his murder meant that Charles was at once friendless and isolated from advisers. He was surrounded by lackeys and yes-men. More important, Buckingham's death also led to the further advancement of Laud, a process attended with high significance. In truth, Laud was promoted, though he never respected the king. In reality, he despised his want of greatness and lack of grip. But that was just what Laud himself did not like. He knew what he wanted, and he got it. Decisive and aggressive in leadership, he set about making the church what he thought it ought to be, knocking aside whoever stood in his way. He more than adequately filled the gap left by Buckingham. That same year the king accepted a petition of right, in which he promised to defend the people's liberties, vowed he would not raise money by taxation without Parliament's consent, nor exercise justice without due regard for the law. If only he had meant it. But he treated the petition with contempt, and his word was worthless. Within a few weeks he was mooting yet another scheme of taxation. Nevertheless the Commons dug its heels in, whereupon Charles promptly dissolved his third Parliament, thereby ruling without it for the next 11 years. By the time of the dissolution, Laud and Charles had come to hate all notion of parliamentary government, and now that they were free of its constraint, they were able to set about the Puritans with a will. They made thorough use of the High Commission and the Star Chamber, courts which amounted to an English Inquisition. Laud promoted his allies to the bench of bishops. In his quest to drag the Church of England back towards Rome, he let no grass grow under his feet, neither during his time as Chancellor of Oxford, which appointment he received in 1630, nor especially in his reign as Archbishop. He also began to put forward a disquieting theory, disturbing from Charles's point of view, that is. He declared that the king was not master in the church, but was under the authority of the clergy, in essence, under Laud. He so dominated the scene, and reigned with such terror, that during the 11 years without a parliament, 4,000 Puritans fled to New England, about 70 of whom were ministers. Laud was immensely pleased with himself over this huge exodus, stupidly ignoring the grievous loss to the country. He had opened a wound from which the lifeblood of the nation poured out. Thus the realm lost some of its finest, most godly, hardest-working citizens, while Laud thought himself clever. At all events, the departure of Puritans, separatists, and others suited his purposes. He was determined to bring Popery back to England, and to do that he knew that he must destroy Puritanism. And he knew what the heart of Puritanism was. It was Calvinism. Matthew Brooks, the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, had expressed his view to Archbishop Appot in 1630, that the doctrine of predestination is the root of Puritanism, and Puritanism is the root of all rebellions and disobedient untractableness in Parliament and so on, and of all schism and sauciness in the country, nay, in the Church itself. This was Laud's own opinion. Therefore he set about the demolition of Calvinism with fanatical zeal. The preaching of the doctrines of grace was outlawed, and all who stood in his way were forced to feel the lash of his whip. Alexander Leighton was one such. He wrote An Appeal to Parliament, Zion's Plea against Prelacy. Expressing himself in very strong terms, he put together a slashing attack upon hierarchy, in which he called the Queen a daughter of Heth, a Canaanite, and an idolatress. This was regarded as treason and blasphemy, for which crime he was summoned to the Star Chamber in 1630. Not allowed to utter a word, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Fleet, plus a fine of £10,000, a massive sum for the time. One ear was cut off, his nose slit, and one cheek branded with a red-hot iron. He was tied to a post and whipped, every lash ripping away flesh. A week later the branding was repeated on the other side of his face. He was clapped in irons under a leaky roof, half-starved, and given no bedding. No wonder his hair and skin came off. His house was ransacked, his wife misused, and his children terrified. On hearing of the sentence, Laud lifted his cap and thanked God, who has given me the victory over my enemies. Leighton spent 10 long years languishing in prison, and was only released by the Long Parliament, but by that time he could hardly see, hear, or walk. Leighton was not the only one to suffer. Many fell foul of Laud's cruel measure. A Devonshire preacher, John Hayden, dared to preach even though forbidden. For this offence he was sent to Bridewell, whipped, and sentenced to hard labour, confined in a cold, dark dungeon during the whole winter, being chained to a post in the middle of a room with irons on his hands and feet, having no other food but bread and water, and a pad of straw to lie on. Another man was fined £500 for breaking a stained glass window. Laud used his power as Archbishop and his influence over the king to put into full effect his hatred of the Puritans. He enforced the Elizabethan settlement, applied it with far more rigour than ever Elizabeth herself did, not allowing the least difference in any matter. Constantinian concepts were put into effect with a vengeance, so that state and church became one, politics and religion were virtually indistinguishable, and private judgment was not allowed. Laud's worship of unity was an idolatry, his detestation of faction a superstition. Church and state were one Jerusalem. In his own words, bearing in mind that by Commonwealth Laud meant state, he was not referring in advance to the 1649 to 1660 Republic, Laud stated, "Both Commonwealth and Church are collective bodies, made up of many into one, and both so near allied that the one, the Church, can never subsist but in the other, the Commonwealth, nay, so near, that the same men which in a temporal respect make the Commonwealth, do in a spiritual make the Church. Jerusalem stands not for the city and the state only, nor for the temple and the church only, but jointly for both." Not only was this utterly alien to the New Testament, here was the making of a disaster of the first order. Church and state welded into one body. What if the one should fall? The other would collapse with it. Under Charles and Laud, church and state were heading for a disaster of cataclysmic proportions. It would not be long before the explosive mixture would blow up in their faces. For years, the membership of church and state had been virtually one and the same, equally compulsory for all. The government had used the church, its organization, its pulpits, its entire fabric, to inform and regulate the people. In short, Christendom was a virtual police state, and if need be, the magistrates carried the sword to make sure things were done exactly as the authorities determined. Laud now forged this system in iron. Puritanism was regarded as blasphemy. Dissent was the unforgivable sin. He knew that as the authority of Scripture increasingly gripped men's minds, so the authority of the state church would decline. He was right. Bent on avoiding this at all costs, Laud dominated the nation in a terror of whippings, croppings, slittings, brandings, and jailings, making sure his discipline should be felt as well as spoken of. An atmosphere of fawning flattery filled the court and the church as men flocked to Laud for benefices or appointments, and preachers vied with each other to make flattering mention of the king. Under Laud's influence, Charles, the court, and the church became entrenched in Arminianism and papistry, to the extent that it could be openly stated, Roman Catholic doctrines be the doctrines of the Church of England. Many Anglican ministers neglected their work, were lazy or downright incompetent. Abuses multiplied as external form was emphasized, and inward spirituality was ignored. The state church from Tudor times had used the clergy as police informers to hold down opposition. Now it was said their chief use was to defend the church and state. One authority has declared the persecution of the Puritans in the time of the Stuarts, on account of canons and rubrics, was in too many cases neither more nor less than zeal for traditions. An enormous amount of zeal was expended in enforcing conformity to the Church of England, while drunkenness, swearing, and open sin were comparatively let alone. Obedience to man-made ecclesiastical rules was required, on pain of fine or imprisonment, while open disobedience to God's 10 Commandments was overlooked. Experience supplies painful proof that traditions, once called into being, are first called useful. Then they become necessary. At last they are too often made idols, and all must bow down to them, or be punished. Let us never forget this vital point. Hooper had been right. Ridley and Cranmer had been wrong. Non-scriptural novelties soon become essentials. But it is not enough to agree with this in retrospect, in a warm historical glow. We must be practical and apply it to our own times, to our churches. Let us see to it that we do not repeat past mistakes. If we do, we may reap past judgments. It can be no surprise to learn that Laud's policy forced a reaction among the politicians who, in sharp contrast to the Church of England, became more and more Puritan and Calvinistic in outlook. So much so, political Puritanism almost assumed the form of an actual party or body during this time. This would have a devastating effect within a few years. Laud was sowing the seeds of war. The two sides were polarizing. Laud not only suppressed the Geneva Bible, he fetched ammunition from the reign of James by a reissue of the Book of Sports. This book, it will be recalled, well nigh authorized morris dancing, archery, and like pursuits to follow morning worship. It was directed especially against the Puritan view of the Lord's Day. Charles now went further than his father James, in that he removed all restrictions on the games, and compelled ministers to read the book or declaration of sports, as it was now called, from the Church of England pulpits on a specified Sunday. The measure was said to regulate the sports. Regulate? It was a virtual license, an incitement to engage in the games. In other words, far from preaching against carnal behaviour, ministers were now obliged to encourage their hearers to play games on the Lord's Day, to engage in the barbarities of bear and bull baiting. This, it goes without saying, was utterly repugnant to the Puritans, but refusal by a minister meant his expulsion from the pulpit. Many opted for ejection. Meanwhile, the overwhelming majority of the membership of the Church of England were highly gratified. Naturally, the unregenerate masses loved the religion, where they felt they were actually encouraged by their spiritual guides, even pressed to indulge themselves on Sundays. The Queen infuriated the Puritans by the way she openly amused herself with plays and dances at court, and thus defiled the day. The Declaration only met its death in May 1643 at the hands of the Long Parliament, who issued an order for its burning by the public hangman. By then it had done untold harm. Richard Baxter recalled how his boyhood Sundays had been spoiled by it. He said, "I cannot forget that in my youth, in those late times, when we lost the labours of some of our conformable godly teachers for not reading the Book of Sports and dancing on the Lord's days. One of my father's own tenants was the town piper, and the place of the dancing assembly was not 100 yards from our door, and we could not, on the Lord's Day, either read a chapter, or pray, or sing a psalm, or catechize, or instruct a servant, but with the noise of the pipe and tabor, and the shoutings in the street continually in our ears. And even among a tractable people, we were the common scorn of all the rabble in the streets, and called Puritans, precisians, and hypocrites, because we rather chose to read the Scriptures than to do as they did, though there was no savour of nonconformity in our family. And when the people by the book were allowed to play and dance out of public service time, they could so hardly break off their sports that many a time the reader was minded to wait till the piper and the players would give over. And sometimes the morris dancers would come into the church in all the linen and scarves and antique dresses, with morris bells jingling at their legs. And as soon as common prayer was read, did haste out presently to their play again. Was this a heavenly conversation? Was this a help to holiness and devotion? Young Baxter was at first attracted by the tomfoolery, but as he said, when I heard them call my father Puritan, it did much to cure me, and alienate me from them, for I considered that my father's exercise of reading the Scripture was better than theirs, and would surely be better thought on by all men at the last. Lord's measures certainly attained their purpose. Godly teachers were silenced, while the profane rabble ruled the proceedings of the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury effectively produced countless congregations which were utterly unprepared for the worship of God. They grudgingly gave the reader a few minutes to gabble off the prayers, while they took a breather in between their pagan games. How rarely the heavenly beings must have rejoiced over sinners coming to repentance under these conditions, and very few saints could have found themselves edified. As the above quotes show, Baxter's father, a Puritan, but decidedly no separatist, preferred to keep his family away from public service, and tried to maintain spirituality at home, seeing there was precious little of it to be found in the Church of England. Typical of Laud's idea of worship was his instruction to the clergy to go in perambulation of the circuit of the parish, a superstitious nonsense which involved a procession once a year round the parish boundaries, the recitation of prayers and psalms at stated intervals along the route, and finally, of course, the consumption of much food and drink. The Star Chamber and High Commission courts put the bishops above the law, and at the same time enabled Charles to raise huge sums of money, always a desperate necessity at court. 2 birds, 1 stone. A minor offence against the state. A minor offence against the state church brought a big fine. Any man who preached against Popery or Arminianism was forced to pay a very large amount for the period, £1,000. By these means, during the 11 years of non-parliamentary government, Puritanism was practically silenced. Puritan lecturers were muzzled, and the number of silenced and deprived ministers grew rapidly under the cruel reign of Laud, the little, low, red-faced man. Puritans were abused, mocked, and treated like criminals. Many could be recognized at a glance by livid scars upon their cheeks. Some bore letters burned into the flesh, SL, standing for seditious libeller, or SS, for sower of sedition. One sufferer wittily quipped, it ought to be more properly to be called the stigmata of Laud. It has been justly said, the catalogue of famous men who, at one time or another during Laud's day of power, were prosecuted, silenced, fined, imprisoned, or driven to retire to the continent, is a melancholy roll or list, and of itself speaks volumes. John Rogers, Daniel Rogers, Thomas Hooker, Dodd, Hildersham, Ward, Cotton, Bridge, Ames, Shepherd, Burles, Greenhill, Calamy, Whately, Wilkinson, Goodwin were all men who had more divinity in their little fingers than Laud had in his whole body. Yet every one of them was visited with Laud's displeasure, and in one way or another disgracefully treated. In short, the public came to the conclusion that Laud and his companions thought Puritanism a greater sin than open immorality, and trifling acts of nonconformity worse than breaking the 10 Commandments. It really came to this, that men said you might lie, or swear, or get drunk, and little notice would be taken. But to be a Puritan, or a nonconformist, was to commit the unpardonable sin. The carnal observance of the Lord's Day, during the time of Richard Baxter's youth, has just been referred to. He also spoke of the dearth of preaching brought about by the measures of James and Charles, especially as enforced by Laud. He said, "We lived in a country that had but little preaching at all. In the village where I was born, there were 4 readers successively in 6 years' time, ignorant men, and 2 of them immoral in their lives. In the village where my father lived, there was a reader of about 80 years of age that never preached, and had 2 churches about 20 miles distant, a huge distance in those days. His eyesight failing him, he said common prayer without the book. But for the reading of the Psalms and chapters, he got a common thresher and day labourer for 1 year, and a tailor another year, for the clerk could not read well. And at last he had a kinsman of his own, the most excellent stage player in all the country, and a good gamester, and good fellow. They got orders, and supplied one of his places. After him another younger kinsman, and at the same time another neighbour's son, one who ventured to preach, and when he had been a preacher about 12 or 16 years, he wanted to give over, it being discovered that his orders were forged by the first ingenious stage player. After him, another neighbour's son took orders, when he had been a common drunkard, and tippled himself into so great a poverty that he had no other way to live. There were the schoolmasters of my youth, except 2 of them, who read common prayer on Sunday and holy days, and taught school and tippled on the weekdays, and whipped the boys when they, that is the masters, were drunk. Within a few miles about us were near a dozen more ministers that were near 80 years old apiece, and never preached, poor, ignorant readers, and most of them of scandalous lives. Only 3 or 4 constant, competent preachers lived near us, and those, though conformable all save one, were the common marks of the people's obloquy and reproach, and any that had but gone to hear them, when he had no preaching at home, was made the derision of the vulgar rabble, under the odious name of a Puritan. In the village where I lived, the reader read the common prayer briefly, and the rest of the day, even till dark night almost, except eating time, was spent in dancing under a maypole, and a great tree not far from my father's door, where all the town did meet together. Richard Sibbes, reckoned to be second only to William Perkins in the pulpit, was one of the best-known Puritans to be attacked by Laud. But all the same he survived as the preacher at Gray's Inn from 1618 until he died in 1635. As early as 1611, Laud had removed Sibbes from his lectureship at Cambridge, but it was after 1627 that he attacked him with resolution. In that year Sibbes, with 3 other Puritans, wrote a letter to the king concerning the lamentable distresses of 240 godly preachers, with their wives and families, and sundry thousands of godly private persons with them, cast out of their house and homes, out of their callings and countries, by the fury of the merciless papists in the region of Bohemia. Laud saw the letter, and certainly studied it, for he marked it with special reference to Sibbes, even correcting the spelling of his name. The 4 Puritans were summoned to appear before the Star Chamber, where they were made out to be notorious delinquents for this offensive letter. Even so, Sibbes continued to preach and publish, openly denouncing the criticism he had received for his sympathy with the suffering Christians. Spies who attended his preaching, besides that of many others, then duly reported back to their paymaster. But Sibbes survived. In one important respect, however, Sibbes repeated the failure of the previous generations. In company with many other conforming Puritans of the time, he refrained from the controversies of the day. Like Perkins before him, he did not push for a thorough reform of church order, even though he himself held convictions about the need of it within the state church. The truth is, he was exceedingly loath to contemplate nonconformity. He certainly had no wish for separation, but neither did he openly strive for reform of the Church of England from within. This was wrong. While thousands of Puritans left the country, many, like Sibbes, persisted in preaching the gospel in defiance of Laud's measures. One bishop complained that the resourceful Puritans would use the running lecture, so-called, because the lecturer went from village to village, and at the end of the week proclaimed where they would have him next, that his disciples might follow. Many people deserted the parish church, so that it was empty when the Anglican recited the prayer book, but then immediately filled up to hear the Puritan preacher in his Geneva cloak. But, and it is essential to give the whole picture, it was not only conforming Puritans who suffered under Laud, far from it. The separatists, of all opinions, were not exempt. They did not escape. Thomas Brewer, a Baptist preacher, was jailed for 14 years. The Anglican Convocation of 1640 pronounced that the canon against papists shall be in full force against all Anabaptists, Brownists, separatists, and other sectaries. Samuel Howe, a Baptist minister, died in prison, and his corpse was degraded by burial in the highway. And as late as 1642, the king was even yet clamouring for measures to stop the over-hasty growth of Anabaptism and other schisms. The poor, despised separatists, along with the conforming Puritans, suffered much, so that the trials for active dissent under Laud are the records of the poor, seized at their worship and confronted with the might of the Church and State in the High Commission. Both the conforming Puritans and the separatists were included in this, but the stress is to be placed on the latter. This is evident in the reference to the poor. Several courageous men, in addition to Leighton, published against the tyranny in direct contravention of the Star Chamber decree. A wag pinned a card to the gate of St. Paul's. It read, "The devil has let this house to Laud for the saying of Mass." It was not a joke, nor is it a laughing matter today. One William Prynne wrote in very strong terms, so strong that he has been much criticized, but in light of Laud's terror, such strong feeling can surely be understood. In one of his books, Prynne exposed the immoralities of the stage, a pastime much loved by the Queen. Not mincing his words, he also truthfully declared that Laud has traitorously and wickedly endeavoured to reconcile the Church of England with the Church of Rome. For these offences, Prynne lost both his ears, was given a massive £5,000 fine, and sentenced to life imprisonment. A certain John Baswick, a Colchester physician, wrote in defence of the plain and obviously true proposition that a bishop and an elder are one and the same in the New Testament. For this, he was no longer allowed to practice as a physician. He was excommunicated, fined £1,000, and sentenced to imprisonment until he cared to recant. A minister, Henry Burton, who preached 2 sermons against novelties in the Church of England, was imprisoned for several years. Despite the severe punishment they received, men of this calibre continued to write, and a stream of pamphlets poured out, even from the prisons. Prynne, Baswick, and Burton pooled their efforts to produce a tract called News from Ipswich, for which Prynne had the stumps of his ears hacked off, and was then branded S.L., while the other 2 prisoners had their ears cropped. Prynne was defiant, calling out, "The more I am beat down, the more I am lift up." A woman's voice encouraged him out of the crowd, saying, "There are many hundreds which, by God's assistance, would willingly suffer for the cause you suffered this day." Baswick's wife took her husband's ears and kissed them. Then all 3 men were sentenced to solitary confinement offshore, no paper, pen, or ink being allowed. During Prynne's trial, Laud delivered a speech which plainly revealed his Romanism. Taking up Bancroft's theme and building on it, he spoke of the altar, in this context a popish word in itself, and compared it with the pulpit, saying, "The altar is the greatest place of God's residence upon earth. I say the greatest, yea, greater than the pulpit. For there it is, this is my body. But in the pulpit it is, this is my word." And a greater reverence, no doubt, is due to the body than to the word of our Lord, and so to the throne where his body is actually present, than to the seat where his word is proclaimed. This was nothing less than unadulterated popery from the lips of an Archbishop of Canterbury. The New Testament, it goes without saying, knows nothing of this ritualistic view of the Lord's Supper. Its emphasis is clearly upon the preaching of the gospel, and not upon the supper in any case. A simple comparison between the space given to preaching and the Lord's Supper in the New Testament will bear out this claim. The scriptural priority is always teaching above the supper. See Acts 2:42, for example. How often do the scriptures record that Paul preached, and how often do they record that he administered the Lord's Supper? I do not belittle the supper by this, but we dare not give it a prominence which the New Testament does not. Lord certainly did give it undue emphasis, besides alleging things about the ordinance that are manifestly untrue. He was decidedly in the wrong when he said that the body of Christ is actually present in the Lord's Supper. It is not. To say it is constitutes a blasphemous lie. What is more, there is no altar in the Church of God except the one mentioned in Hebrews 13:10. We have an altar. This statement, it need not be said, does not refer to a material altar, nor does it refer to the Lord's table, which is always called a table and never an altar. The Lord's Supper is never called a sacrifice. The altar of Hebrews 13:10 is none other than Christ himself. He is priest, altar, and sacrifice. He is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament shadows. To introduce a physical altar into the church, and then set men apart as priests in order that they make a sacrifice upon that altar, shows the utmost blasphemy and highest contempt of the one finished sacrifice of Christ. It is damnable. Despite opposition, Charles and Laud persisted in their sadistic folly, which only served to unite the common people against them. Thus, in trying to exterminate Puritanism and separatism, they actually succeeded in stirring the people to defy their rulers' exercise of absolute power. While it is certain that only a tiny minority of the population were truly spiritually minded and wanted scriptural reform of the state church, nevertheless, the king madly drove the mass of the citizens into a corner. There could be only one outcome. Charles let his madness run riot in 1637, when he tried to take episcopacy into Presbyterian Scotland, the land of Knox, into a country and among a people he had never either understood or liked. But even here, as in England, it was really Arminianism which stuck in the Presbyterian gullet, not bishops. After all, the Scots had managed with a form of Episcopalianism for 40 years. They would only throw off bishops at the 1638 Assembly, so that many of them had never known a fully Presbyterian system. Even Robert Bailey, usually regarded as a Presbyterian through and through, was not prepared to say that some form of episcopacy was without scriptural warrant. In other words, Bailey and his friends would have tolerated a moderate Episcopalianism if it had been Calvinistic. As I say, it was not so much the office of bishop which rankled with the Scots, it was the Arminianism of the bishops which Laud would have imposed upon them. That was the trouble. The Arminianism would lead to popery, and that the Scots would not tolerate at any price. Calvinism was wanted by them. Indeed, their assembly modelled itself on the pattern of Dort. Notwithstanding, Laud was determined to impose the prayer book north of the border, but in trying to do it, he was faced with a riot which broke out in Edinburgh. No wonder, since in the book the real presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper was as plainly taught as any papist could wish, so that it set all Scotland in a flame by attempting to introduce it in public worship. That was the point. Popery was intended by Laud, and popery the Scots would not have. One remarkable woman, Jenny Geddes, threw her stool at the minister. "Will you read that mass book in my ear?" she demanded of him. There it was again. The Scots would not have the mass book. Charles and Laud would not back down, however, but insisted on compliance, blaming the bishops for their lack of courage in not forcing through the measures. For all that, the Scots would not be browbeaten, and their opposition was resolute. One wrote graphically, "The rotten dregs of Popery, which were never purged away from England and Ireland, and having once been spewed out with detestation, are licked up again in Scotland. The Church of England is miscoloured with the painted lustre of the mother of harlots. Her shamefast forehead has received the mark of the beast. Her lovely locks are frizzled with the curls of Antichrist fashions. Her chaste ears are made to listen to the friends of the great whore." This time the king had gone too far. He had bitten off more than he could chew. In 1638 the defiant Scots renewed the National Covenant, a petition drawn up for signature by all those who desired to register a protest. The first covenant had been put in place in 1581 for those who vowed they would defend the country against Popery. To this very covenant, clauses were now added to the end that Presbyterianism must be the state church order in Scotland. It met with a huge response. 300,000 people signed, some adding "until death" after their name, while some did draw their own blood and use it in place of ink. Conflict was bound to follow. Laud dug his heels in, and stubbornly pronounced that he was determined to be obeyed. The Scots, for their part, stoutly replied that they would never have the book. The 1638 Assembly refused to let itself be dissolved, but went on to denounce episcopacy, the prayer book, and Laud. Charles was left with a stark choice. He could either yield, or he could raise an army, go to war, and try to defeat the Scots, his own subjects. In his madness, he opted for war. But without a parliament, he had insufficient money to raise enough men. Even so, he tried to fight. It was a vain hope, and the first bishops' war soon ended, when Charles was brought to terms at Berwick. The peace was uneasy, however, while Charles played for time. Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, now all-powerful at court, politically speaking, proposed that Parliament should be recalled in order to provide sufficient money to raise an army. It is clear that the king and his advisers had taken leave of their senses. An increasingly Presbyterian Parliament, to be asked to vote money to wage war on Presbyterian Scots. What utter folly! Recalled in 1640, the short Parliament lasted only 3 weeks before it, too, met the common fate and was dissolved. Rightly, it would not even consider voting money for the king before the many grievances of the past 11 years had been addressed. Strafford remained arrogantly confident despite this setback. He bragged that he could raise an army of 10,000 Irish, 10,000 Papists, in other words, to defeat the Scots, after which they would bring the English to heel. Nevertheless, there was one difficulty which even the ever-optimistic Strafford could not get round. It was the old question once again: money. Therefore Charles dreamt up new taxes. The Queen wanted to ask the Pope for the wherewithal. High offices were sold for cash. Strafford went cap in hand to Papist Spain, and the worth of the coinage was debased to 1/4 of its value. Nor was Laud idle all this time. He saw to it that new canons were passed within the Church of England to increase the power of the king even more. But by this time the king and his councillors were living in a fantasy world, in cloud cuckoo land. Their end was in sight. Riots broke out, and Laud only narrowly escaped with his life at Lambeth. Then alarming news came. The Scots were on the march. Charles and Strafford scrambled together, a makeshift army and took it north to meet the Scots in the field. But the king's cause was hopeless, and he was forced to agree to yet another treaty, to cobble together an uneasy peace, this time at Ripon. The Second Bishops' War was over. It was significant that by this time the Scots allowed Charles 2 months free of war, as long as he called a parliament. Accordingly, on the 3rd of November 1640, the Long Parliament began its sitting. The country had now reached an appalling state of disorder. The judges have overthrown the law, and the bishops the gospel, just about summed it up. Parliament, overwhelmingly Puritan, took a grip on things before total anarchy descended upon the nation. It declared that its will must prevail, and prevail it did. Strafford was sent to the Tower, as was Laud, the former being executed in 1641, Laud in 1645. Meanwhile, Laud's victims were released, among them Prynne, Burton, Baswick, and Leighton. The latter crawled from his prison after 10 years in a loathsome and ruinous dog-hole, full of rats and mice. By this time he was a broken wreck of a man, aged 72, and his pitiful appearance moved the people to tears. The crowds welcomed such men with great joy. Riots broke out. Surplices, altars, and prayer books were destroyed. The Puritans rushed into print to so great an extent that there was a veritable explosion of long-stifled convictions and suppressed opinions. But those staunchly held opinions were hopelessly divided. On the one hand, the Root and Branch petition, designed to abolish episcopacy, was signed by 15,000 Londoners. It was presented to Parliament on the 11th of December 1640, and its message was clear enough: no more bishops. Yet, at the other extreme, Laud having done his work so thoroughly, counter-petitions actually demanded the absolute retention of bishops. Otherwise there would be no church, no ordination, no Lord's Supper, they said. And in between, 700 ministers wanted episcopacy retained, but somewhat reformed. Parliament's response to these contradictory demands was to fudge. They agreed to tolerate episcopacy, but there were warning signs of trouble to come. A number of MPs belonged to the Root and Branch party, including the Puritan member for Cambridge, one Oliver Cromwell. With the establishment of the Long Parliament, Puritanism now began to flourish, and many nonconformists gladly returned from exile. Independents, Congregationalists, Baptists, and the rest grasped the opportunity which presented itself, so that no fewer than 80 congregations of separate churches were set up in London and its surroundings. The bishops might sneer that these churches were instructed by guides fit for them, cobblers, tailors, felt makers, and such like trash. But the fact is, as Puritanism was beginning to hold the high ground in England, so the separatists took full advantage of the breathing space this afforded them. But they had need to be quick, before the powerful machinery of state Puritanism was set in place. Once that happened, the all dominant Puritans would then try to crush the life out of them. Where Charles and Laud had failed, they would do their utmost to put a stop to nonconformity. Even so, the real and unanswerable religious question for the Long Parliament was, exactly what sort of Puritanism was state Puritanism to be? Many exiles returning from New England were independents or Congregationalists who, along with Baptists, all went into print against Presbyterianism, and did so as resolutely as against episcopacy. John Lilburne wrote a book against his former master, the Presbyterian William Prynne. It was significantly entitled, "Come Out of Her, My People, a Just Apology for the Way of Total Separation." Things were altogether in the melting pot, and the fire underneath was getting very warm. The pace of change is illustrated by the experience of John Milton, who in 1641 published 3 pamphlets opposing episcopacy pamphlets which were pro-Presbyterian. But a year later, he had changed his mind. He published another volume, The Reason of Church Government, in which he was moving towards independency. The earth was shaking. In the face of all the ferment, Parliament decided to call an assembly at Westminster to try to bring some sort of order and uniformity to religion, and thus prevent utter chaos. The state-church question had to be settled once and for all. In 1642, a letter was sent even to America to ask representatives to attend the assembly. It was signed by Oliver Cromwell, among others. Nevertheless, the government of the Church was not going to be an easy matter to settle, to put it mildly. Parliament was fully united in only one cause in religion. It was anti-Popery. It had only one policy, which was intolerance. The Puritan Parliament was thoroughly fed up with separatists of all kinds and wanted a uniform state church. We have seen this storm brewing up several times during the course of the previous 80 years. The black clouds had been lowering. Now the thunderclaps were to roll. Yet the great question remained as intractable as ever. What sort of national church would it be? Which form would it take? If the majority in Parliament got its way, there is little doubt what would happen. It has been said, though it may be an exaggeration, that out of some 200 members, about 150 were Presbyterians. But many outside Parliament wanted something other than Presbyterianism, something very other. If that was not enough, the peaceful and orderly settlement of the state itself also presented enormous difficulties. Fear of popery was everywhere, and with good reason, since the Queen continued aggressive in her Romanism, even flaunting it. Charles was playing his usual game, speaking fine words to Parliament, but all the while engaged in secret deals with foreign governments, even with the Pope, to raise an army, to wage war against his own subjects. He actually tried to treat with the Scots, making wild promises to appease their Presbyterianism, but lying at every turn, for underneath he remained firmly of his expressed opinion that Presbyterianism is no religion for gentlemen. In reality, he intended to bring back Laud's uniformity in state and church, even at this late stage, if only he could manage it. Though Parliament might want its own sort of uniformity, if the king could only scrape an army together, he would show them. There was plenty of fight left in him. He even went to Parliament in person, storming in to arrest 5 of his leading opponents, but found that the birds had flown. Bitterly frustrated, the king arrogantly demanded to know where they were. Speaker William Lenthal bravely and stoutly replied in momentous words of defiance, words which resonate to this day. "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see, nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here." The king left the House empty-handed, then quitted London. Now the die was cast. Within a few months, Charles had sent Henrietta to France with their children and the crown jewels, while he had travelled north to Nottingham. On the 22nd of August, 1642, he took the fateful step. He unfurled his standard to wage war on Parliament. The first civil war had begun. The next time the king would enter the city of London would be to answer to the nation he had so grievously misruled, and to face execution. In Whitehall, on a frosty morning, the 30th of January 1649, Charles Stuart's head would be severed from his body by a blow from the executioner's axe. In the meantime, much blood would flow as the nation divided and began to tear itself apart. The English Revolution had begun.